Mr. Rakesh Dwivedi, the learned Solicitor General, Mr. Dushar Mehta, distinguished parliamentarian and senior counsel, Mr. Kapil Sibal, all those in session of book and its author. And last not the least, the very dear family of Rakeshji. Does not begin with theory or ideology. It begins with curiosity. Speaking for myself, as a child, I was drawn more to maps than to dates. Maps which showed empires stretching across and routes that carried not just goods, but ideas, authority, and power. History is not merely a record of what has happened or of dates. History is also a record of how what happened is explained. History is also about interpreting the course of events, a task in which the writer and the reader participate. It is precisely this question, how power explains itself, that lies at the heart of Mr. Rakesh Dwivedi's remarkable new book that we gather upon to reflect and celebrate today. In our early encounters, history appeared orderly and settled. Narratives seemed to follow a predictable rhythm. Empires rose and empires fell, administrations changed, institutions remained. The British Empire was often presented in that neutral cadence of time associated with governance, railways, codified law, and administrative structures. The framing suggests inevitability rather than contest, as if events unfolded under the historical momentum rather than through the deliberate choices of power. As school children, we rarely pause to question the structure of the narrative, nor were we taught to do so. With time, reading widened beyond school texts and summaries. More detailed histories entered the frame, many written from British perspectives and situated within imperial scholarship. These works spoke in a language of confidence and administrative rationality. Colonization was described less as conquest and more as governance stepping into a vacuum. Authority appeared structured, deliberate, and stabilizing. The persuasive force of these accounts lay not in overt argument, but in their assured tone. Confidence is the tone of indoctrination. As reading deepened, other interpretive traditions entered the landscape. Nationalist histories highlighted resistance, moral injury, and the aspirations that shaped the freedom struggle. Marxist scholarship examined the empire through the lenses of capital, labor, and extraction. No single approach appeared complete in itself. Each explained something important, though none explained everything. What lingers, however, is not disagreement, but a subtle sense of unease. Certain formulations encountered repeatedly across very different works remained curiously stable. In 1883, John Seeley observed in The Expansion of London, 2 courses of lectures, that India can hardly be said to have been conquered at all by foreigners. She has rather conquered herself. That is what John Seeley said in 1883. The remark was certainly not notable for its insight, but for its measure of assurance. It reduced a complex history of external domination to an internal process, reframing conquest as adjustment and foreign rule as something almost self-generated. What stayed was not the claim itself, but the confidence with which it was stated, the ease with which a proposition of such consequence was presented as self-evident. That confidence resurfaced in different forms across imperial writing, shaping explanations that appeared settled even when the historical experience they described was marked by rupture, coercion, and profound asymmetries of power. The book by Mr. Rakesh Dwivedi matters not only as intellectual history, but also as constitutional intervention. Mr. Dwivedi is among the leading voices of constitutional law of our time. He is known for refusing to treat doctrine as immutable and for inviting the Supreme Court to revisit questions long considered to be settled. constitution benches in recent years, including in the challenge to the abrogation of Article 370, where he argued that the powers under Article 370 were constituent in character and must be interpreted through the original constitutional scheme rather than inherited doctrinal shorthand. He made an impassioned plea before the 9-judge Constitution bench on taxation and mineral royalties, contributing to the court's reconsideration of earlier principles. Across these matters, his advocacy has assisted the court in confronting difficult doctrinal questions, constitutional power, and settled precedent. That same professional instinct to question what appears settled shapes the method of this book. A careful reading of colonial history across regions reveals that the justificatory patterns, the formulae, appear across continents. One repeatedly encounters a language of order, civilization, and progress. Colonial intervention is described as reluctant governance responding to disorder rather than a case of deliberate expertise, are often portrayed as lacking coherence or historical continuity, not as a debatable claim but as an accepted premise. With repetition, assertion begins to pass for proof, even where the supporting evidence is thin. The recognition of this pattern does not arise from assertion. It emerges through comparative reading across colonial contexts. Studies of French Africa, including Alice L. Conklin's A Mission to Civilize, describe colonial rule as a pedagogic enterprise, a mission civilisatrice prepared for self-government. British writing on Ireland, such as James Anthony Froude's work on the 18th century Ireland, presents imperial intervention as an unavoidable response to disorder, even recasting seizure of authority as an administrative necessity. In international law scholarship, Anthony Angi's Imperialism, Sovereignty and the Making of International Law, demonstrates how similar justificatory narratives entered legal doctrine, where domination was reframed as trusteeship and sovereignty itself was redefined through the vocabulary of civilization. Viewed together, historical description begins to resemble a justificatory framework, one that validates power while presenting itself as a neutral analysis. What stands out across these accounts is not overt hostility, but pattern consistency. Across regions, the empire is presented as a reluctant custodian, civilization as an obligation, and resistance as a disorder to be managed. Aimé Césaire described this process with precision when he wrote that colonization worked through the thingification of the colonized, reducing lived human experience into administrative categories. Frantz Fanon, reflecting on Africa, observed that colonial domination was exercised with his insight does not describe isolated cruelty. It describes a system in which coercion becomes routine when expressed in the language of order and necessity. When these perspectives are placed alongside Indian history, the structural similarities are hard to miss. What first appears as separate explanations begins to look like parts of a recurring justificatory pattern. That pattern validates power while presenting itself as a neutral description across imperial settings. This recurring justificatory structure is identified by Mr. Dwivedi with analytical precision as political mythology. The expression is carefully chosen by him. These narratives are not dismissed in the book as crude propaganda or deliberate falsehood. They are examined as systems of explanation, internally coherent, widely repeated, and persuasive precisely because they do not present themselves as ideology. Political mythology operates by converting contestable propositions into background assumptions. Familiarity then replaces scrutiny, and claims gradually lose the appearance of being claims at all. What sets this book apart is the method through which that political mythology is brought to light. Rakesh Dwivedi does not follow a conventional chronological narrative, nor does he organize his analysis around isolated historical episodes. His approach resembles that of a distinguished senior counsel that he is, conducting a sustained case across jurisdictions and time periods. He identifies recurring propositions that surface across centuries of imperial writing and then tests them against evidence drawn from economic history, global geopolitics, and comparative colonial experience. Each proposition is evaluated in connection with others that serve the same justificatory process, allowing patterns to emerge through structured examination rather than assertion. This method becomes especially visible in the way the book organizes a vast that India possessed no meaningful civilizational history or only a history of successive conquests. Second, that British rule was driven by a moral obligation to civilize. And third, that empire in India emerged accidentally as an unintended consequence of trade and political disorder. These claims are not dismissed as caricatures. They are reconstructed with care, often from British archival and scholarly sources, and presented in their original form before being subjected to close examination. He debunks them with the authority of a learned mind. The examination that follows is marked by restraint and discipline. Rakesh Dwivedi has mastered the art of understatement, in the court and off the court. He does not answer one assertion with another. Each explanation is situated within a wider global context, demonstrating how comparable claims were advanced in Africa, Ireland, and the Caribbean. Attention is drawn to internal contradictions, to shifts in position when convenience required. The technique resembles cross-examination rather than rebuttal. Readers are encouraged to recognize patterns in the evidence rather than accept conclusions on authority. Another notable feature of the book is its disciplined refusal of romanticism. Its foundation lies instead in demonstrable continuities, in institutions, trade networks, and forms of political organization, along with the recognition that political conquest does not erase civilizational history. The analysis therefore avoids two opposite errors: imperial dismissal on one side and nationalist simplification on the other. Complexity is preserved even when it unsettles familiar narratives. The structure of the book reflects the instincts of a seasoned lawyer. History is organized around arguments and propositions rather than around isolated events. That choice gives the work the character of a sustained inquiry into how power constructs its own explanations. The result is a text that speaks not only to historians, but also to those engaged with law, governance, and constitutional interpretation. Political mythology, once recognized, becomes difficult to ignore. Mr. Dwivedi's contribution lies in making these justificatory structures visible, and in doing so, enabling a more candid engagement with history and its continuing effect on public life. The cumulative effect of his analysis is a shift in the frame through which India's colonization is understood. Imperial arguments are no longer approached merely as positions to be accepted or rejected. They are examined as recurring justificatory devices that traveled across time and geography. When viewed in that light, these explanations lose their appearance of independence. They begin to resemble a repertoire deployed wherever an empire required moral legitimacy, rather than responses shaped solely by local conditions. India therefore appears in the book not as an isolated case, but as part of a wider structured pattern of domination supported by similar explanatory tools. Viewed through this structural lens, interconnected rather than separate. The colonial assertion that India lacked a real civilizational history, the proposition that colonial rule was a civilized as an unintended outcome of trade or disorder, operate together and reinforce each other. Each performs a different justificatory role, but all move towards the same result, the displacement of responsibility. Conquest is recast as inevitability, extraction as governance, and resistance as dysfunction. The book does not lay out these conclusions through assertion. It places the propositions side by side and makes their internal logic visible across cases, but rest on the same underlying premise when closely examined. The force of the book becomes especially clear when one examines the concrete illustration through which these hypotheses are tested. Mr. Dwivedi draws, for instance, on documented imperial practice in the Americas and Ireland, describing the Spanish encomienda system of forced native labor, the near eradication of indigenous populations in the Caribbean and North America, and the recorded mass deportations and killings in Ireland, alongside the parallel intellectual narrative that portrayed native societies as barbaric and historyless. He places these beside British claims of a civilizing mission in India and the repeated portrayal of colonization as a necessity rather than a conquest. Reading these materials together, drawn from archival records and established historical works cited in the book, reveals how justificatory narratives hardened into governing assumptions and traveled into policy and institutional reasoning. The argument therefore reaches beyond historical correction. It asks present readers to remain alert to how inherited legal and administrative frameworks may still carry traces of those earlier imperial premises. Reflection on the book also really leads to a related question, not only about history, but about how human judgment is formed. Political mythology, as the work explains, rarely operates through explicit deception or overt persuasion. Its influence rests on familiarity and repetition. Explanations encountered across generations tend to be accepted without insights from cognitive psychology suggest that this tendency is not an exception in human reasoning. It is part of how the mind processes and stabilizes information over time. Contemporary cognitive research indicates that certain historical explanations endure not after repeated verification, but after repeated exposure. The familiar descriptions of colonial rule, framed in the language of order, administration, and institutional continuity, circulated in discourse without deliberate endorsement or careful sourcing. The striking feature was the ease with which such narratives acquire legitimacy through repetition alone. Psychology provides a useful framework for understanding this process. Research shows that individuals often rely on authority bias, placing trust in claims associated with established institutions or texts, even when the original source is no longer clearly remembered. Repetition deepens this effect through what psychologists call, Israeli American psychologist in Thinking Fast and Slow explains that human cognition operates under the law of least effort, in which intuitive judgments are readily accepted because deliberate scrutiny requires attention and mental energy. Through narrative framing, through the language used to describe suffering and responsibility, this becomes evident in how colonial era famines are recorded and remembered. Official reports and later histories often present these episodes as administrative failures, policy miscalculations, or logistical breakdowns rather than as consequences of extractive economic structures. The vocabulary is managerial. Committees are noted, relief codes are discussed, and procedures are revised. Structural deprivation moves into the background. When a human catastrophe is translated into administrative language, moral evaluation weakens. Coercive outcomes do not vanish, they are recast as procedural events. In the aftermath of the Bengal famine of 1943, the Famine Inquiry Commission documented a massive surge in mortality during the famine months, while later demographic and economic studies have placed the total deaths in the range of 2 to 3 million. Archival research and modern scholarship show that the crisis cannot be understood only as a failure of crops. Wartime procurement, price escalation, transport controls, and denial policies affecting boats and grain movement significantly shaped outcomes on the ground. Several studies also document that imperial wartime shipping priorities and diversification of supplies, including war allocations directed by the Winston Churchill government, formed part of the policy background within which scarcity intensified. When read against this evidentiary material, the description of the famine merely as an administrative breakdown appears incomplete. The language of procedure does not fully capture social and economic reality. India faced death, deprivation, and starvation by the sheer subordination of humanitarian concerns to the geopolitical priorities of the imperial government. This pattern of framing produces a subtle but durable psychological effect. When domination is repeatedly described as governance, the mind begins to register it as necessity rather than coercion. Resistance, when consistently labeled as disorder, that explains the colonial origin of the offense of sedition. Hierarchy, when presented as functional organization, gradually acquires the character of normalcy. The striking feature of this process is the limited effort it demands. No formal defense of empire is required. Familiar language performs the work. Over time, readers inherit not only recorded facts but also intuitions about authority, stability, and legitimacy. These intuitions begin to shape historical understanding even before evidence is carefully assessed, impervious to reality. Distorted narratives therefore carry consequences beyond the written page. They influence how power is perceived, how inequality is rationalized, and how responsibility is located within institutions. Political mythology persists less through winning arguments and more through shaping perception. Awareness of that process is necessary for any disciplined reading of history and for sound public judgment. Research on political myths adds another layer to this understanding. Empirical studies indicate when the personal cost of questioning them is low and social reinforcement is strong. Belief then stabilizes into what scholars describe as a collective equilibrium. Persistence does not arise from a lack of intelligence, but from incentives and offers uncertain rewards. Conformity provides psychological comfort and social legitimacy. The implication is clear. Inherited explanations must be deliberately tested, not passively assumed. Even today, colonial institutions are often cited as self-evident proof of benevolent governance. Railways are a common example. A closer account asks why lines were laid where they were and whose economic interests they served. Early railway planning combined commercial objectives with military needs, including frontier control and rapid troop movement. Railway lines linked production zones to ports to move primary commodities to export markets. By independence, route kilometers, giving it enormous logistical reach across the subcontinent. Viewed in that context, the colonial effort to entrench the railways appears not simply as a public good, but as a key instrument of imperial logistics serving strategic and extractive priorities into how legitimacy and authority are understood. When domination is described as governance and extraction of natural resources as administration, hierarchy appears natural rather than constructed. Political mythology survives by presenting itself as common sense. Mr. Dwivedi's work disrupts that familiarity and restores critical distance where acceptance might otherwise be automatic. This leads directly to present relevance. The value of the book lies not only in its account of the past, but in what it helps us recognize in the present. Historical narratives shape institutional memory and public reasoning. How a society understands its past influences, how it approaches authority, dissent, and equality. History continues to operate within how we think and judge. In a time when public discourse is often driven by simplification, but for the habits of question it encourages in the present. For a constitutional democracy founded on dignity, equality, and fraternity, critical engagement with history is a civic responsibility, not an academic luxury. The colonization crusade and the freedom of India remind us that understanding must precede judgment and that inherited narratives must be tested, not repeated. The book invites engagement rather than agreement and replaces easy conclusions with clarity. Such intellectual discipline is necessary for any society committed to constitutional self-government. My compliments to a distinguished author. He has taken time and effort to forsake the familiar perquisites of a successful career at the bar to ask probing questions. In doing so, Mr. Rakesh Dwivedi eloquently engages with the past, redefines the present, and reimagines the future.